like living in Los Angeles, living in LA, and seeing how quickly people have decided to jump back into like spring break 2019. It's quite the energy. So
Whoa.
yeah, so I live in an area of Long Beach that's very has a big family population, has is very multi-generational, but whenever I visit my friends out in the city itself, it's like a whole different world. I was down in Huntington Beach, which I call the Florida of California, because it basically is a microcosm of like a more moneyed, whiter, more conservative, more belligerent slice of California, kind of like harkening back to the old school Orange County kind of
Wow.
ethic. And so like going out there, you just see a radically different world from what we saw even like a couple of months ago. So that's been interesting. Uh,
Politically and intoxicatedly.
those go together, right? You gotta have your sort. Well, I mean, like if you think there's this what's this, the MMA fighter, there's a right-wing MMA fighter who got elected to one of the city councils in SoCal. So you've got like
Wow.
yeah, I'll try and find the name, but there's an interesting sort of, I think, cultural dynamic in California that people don't understand or realize not living in it, where they think,
Mm.
okay, it's a blue state, it's very liberal, it's going to be progressive, and really there is an enormous amount of diversity both
Mm.
within that like liberal bloc and then also just ideologically across the spectrum, and that includes way more Republicans, way more right wingers, way more conservative Dems than people realize.
Do you remember like the power grab that led to the Schwarzenegger rise to the governorship?
The
Wait, it
one they're
was a
trying to
power
do
grab?
now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, I mean, Gray Davis was the Democratic governor of California, really struggled through uh, handling his administration, messaging. The economy was really the drag on his approval ratings. And so the way the California recall system works, which is kind of ridiculous, is that you have to basically vote A, do you want to keep the governor? Or B, do you not want to keep the governor? In which case, choose from this list. And there's like dozens of rando candidates of varying levels of quality and seriousness.
Hmm.
And name recognition is the winner in that, right? And so he
Hmm.
won pretty handily. But yeah, he's that's how a Republican governor ran the most democratic state in the fifth largest economy in the world, right there.
It's kind of funny because I didn't know Schwarzenegger was Republican, but it makes sense. Obviously, he's rich and he's famous.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well, I
was
mean,
he voting Republican for years before that, or did like they just sort of told him like you are Republican
You're
now?
the
right?
you're the
This is what we're
Republican
doing.
now.
Yeah. I'll be honest. Like, can you? I am having a hard time imagining like a young, like not even young, like a Terminator, like first Terminator era Arnold Schwarzenegger having any politics beyond not wanting to pay more taxes, right?
Right.
Like, that's got to
Yeah.
be the animating reason there.
Welcome to the Avant Inn. I am one of your hosts, Jerome Allen,
And I'm another host, Topher Wagner.
and we are doom scrolling the news, so you don't have to. Today we have amazing, a smart, and intelligent person on the cast, Joshua De Leon.
Woo.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome
Good to
aboard.
be here. Thanks for having me.
So Josh, what do you do in the life, in the world?
I wear a few hats, and I think there's a couple that might be of interest. I mean, during my day job, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. So I work with companies, clients, organizations to really, I guess, translate racism, sexism, structural inequities into things that they can understand and then work towards change that way. Um, but I think most pertinent to our conversation, I'm an activist and community organizer out here in the LA area, which is the unceded land of the Tongva, Kizh, and Gabrielino people, and working a lot in the Asian American Filipinx community. And I recently dipped my toes into the weird world of electoral politics and specifically the California Democratic Party structure. So that's an interesting space, and I'm someone in my like late 20s with a community organizing background entering into a very unusual world and trying to figure it out.
Are you finding working in electoral politics is hopeful?
Hopeful? That's a very 2008.
An audacity
Change.
for hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's spaces where there's a lot of hope, and I'm gonna qualify everything I say today because that's the era we live in. But I think there's hope in seeing folks like myself and others who are new to the political space, who are BIPOC, grounded in community organizing, grounded in activism, who are actually going into these spaces who never would have before. Like I know multiple people who are running for Congress or local government, city council in the state and across the country, who I know would never have done that if we were in a different era at a different time. And so we're being called to that space. At the same time, there is sort of this, I think, dynamic where you have an old guard, and that not necessarily literally age, right? It's more politically an old guard. There's a lot of really effective progressive folks who are generationally elders to me, and there's a lot of folks who are young who are not, right? But there's kind of a political ideological old guard, even in a place like California, that's taking a while to shift. And so we have an interesting sort of internal dynamic in California, where you've got it kind of mirroring a lot of the left center sort of struggles nationally, right? You've got this weird dynamic here, and we're sort of deciding who we want to be and what we're going to do over the next few years.
You go.
I guess I'm just curious. Like, do you think that a lot of the politicians that are even in that old guard were maybe more progressive at some point and just get jaded over time? Like, is there a moment when you start getting to the electoral politics that you have to start like putting some of your ideals on the back burner until there's a practical way to accomplish them?
You're like, how am I going to get the Fresno vote?
Yeah,
I
like,
need the Fresno
when do you start
vote.
compromising, and when do you just keep putting your foot down and let's say like, no, I won't budge on anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple pieces here, right? One is I think it depends on how you enter into the political space. I think there's a lot of people right now who are saying we're not going to take donations from fossil fuel companies, from police unions, from blank, 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 right? And I think that that's a very new development. I actually went to a how to run a campaign like training course a couple years ago, and they basically said, do not ever turn down money. Just say that you're not going to follow them, like just like stick true to your guts, but never turn down free money. And it was interesting because like that was the conventional wisdom. And now you have people who are running successful campaigns saying no to all of this, right? No to all this funding, no to all this money. And I think that's one big part. In terms of like compromising, I know that for me, it's a little bit easier because my position right now is as an elected delegate for my assembly district. And so basically what that means is that I vote on Democratic Party officers in California. I vote on the platform. Because it's strictly speaking a voting position, I really don't have to compromise, right? I'm not,
Right.
building a coalition to pass a bill. I'm not running a budget, so I don't need to compromise. And so for me, I think that's the point of my role, is to be kind of the annoying activist pushing the conversation and pushing the boundary. And that's an important role actually in the party.
How did you become a delegate? Like, what was the process of doing such?
Yeah, so, and I think there might be something similar in all states, but just not something that people are aware of. In California, there are about 3,000 delegates to the California Democratic Party. So that's kind of similar to how there's like a bunch of delegates to the DNC writ large. California is kind of a microcosm of that. So in California, we have about 3,000 or so, give or take a few hundred, 3,000 or so delegates, divided pretty roughly evenly between people who are elected, like myself as an assembly district delegate, people who are appointed by elected officials, and people who come in through the county central committees. So those are kind of these three bodies that people can come in. Within that, you're basically deciding the party platform for the supermajority party in the fifth largest economy in the world. And that was the appeal to me. Here's the thing. They don't advertise these positions. when I ran, the winning votes, like the number one vote getters in my district were like 600 votes, right? In a district of 500,000 people.
Wow.
And so you're not seeing the kinds of effort to drive up vote counts. And the working theory for a lot of the progressive organizers out here in the state is that to some degree that's intentional, or at the very least it's an apathy with the incentive to keep that inertia going. Because when people don't know about it, it's going to disproportionately be people who have proximity to power already, who are already aligned with people in positions of power. And so they can run for these delegate seats and basically take that third that's elected and make that match ideologically and in terms of relationships to those other two buckets that are more proximate to the centers of power. And that's something that in the last set of elections for the delegate seats actually was something that progressive organizers realized they could disrupt. So you may have seen that Dianne Feinstein did not get the California Democratic Party endorsement when she was primaried by Kevin De Leon, no relation, because the California progressive wing basically stormed these delegate seats, won these seats unexpectedly in these low vote margin races, and were able to basically prevent from getting the endorsement, right? And so that there is an amount of power that we can wield because there's an inefficiency in the party structure right now. Originally to the benefit of the people with institutional power, but increasingly so getting shifted to people in the grassroots.
Wow.
How do we resolve this? Because obviously the two-party system is making it difficult for you guys to be actually as efficient as you want as progressives or as a more centrist part of the party. But on a state level of California, can't you really just break off and reinvent the wheel somehow? Are the systems just too rooted in that California soil that you can't just be all right, no, we're gonna make a new delegation and we're going to not have to play the game to get Dianne Feinstein her endorsement or not?
Right. I think that's a really good question. And I think there's a couple answers that may not add up to a satisfying set of prescriptions to change, but let me try here. Well, I think one is just looking at the party structure. Elected officials get a whole bunch of appointments. For example, the Senate President pro tempore in the California State Senate gets 50 or so appointments. So they single-handedly can outweigh multiple entire districts' delegations of assembly district delegates because one person has all these appointment power. So that's one, I think, structural barrier, is that the elected officials carry a lot of weight. They can't actually compel people to vote along with them, but if you're going to be appointed by someone, you're probably going to be doing those votes. I think that's one challenge. I think the other is that it's just there's not a lot of information out there that's accessible, that's multilingual, that is dispersed across the state in such a way to actually galvanize people to participate. Like, for example, me, as someone who I would argue is a more engaged voter than the average person,
Right.
I didn't even know the position that I ran for until last year. Until some months before I ran, I didn't know what it was because there isn't that effort. And so if you think about the amount of electoral literacy that you need to build, it's not just Democrats are good, right? Debatable, but better than Republican in this case, right? Democrats, it's not just Democrats are good, it's also Democrats are good. And within Democrats, there's these nuances of political parties and ideologies. And within that, here are the ways that impacts you. And then within that, here's the party structure you can press upon. And then within that, here are the things you can vote for to actually shift that. So, and especially for the really large number of folks who might be aligned with us, but don't speak English as a first language, or not in communities that are being directly built with by the institutional party. I think those are some of the barriers that we have to really overcome so people are aware, educated, and empowered to plug in that way.
So you had said earlier that there's been a wave of more inclusive and diverse people entering the arena in terms of elections. But what would you say is the current ratio? Is it still more white than so, or is it it actually leveled out within this year's election cycle?
I think I'm seeing more, and this is all very anecdotal, but at least for the people that I'm personally connected with, it seems to be a higher number of women, higher number of gender nonconforming folks, higher number of BIPOC folks running, which is good. The rate of winning is not as high as the increase, I think, in people running, and that's I think that next frontier, right? It's I think we're seeing the shift where people are saying, hey, like, this is not going to change unless I'm the one doing it. People are running for these seats. There's a great candidate running for LA Controller, Kenneth Mejia, who's a Filipino American organizer who's trying to take this very powerful and under appreciated seat. I have a friend, Sylvester Ani Jr., who's running to primary the current incumbent congresswoman in California District 38. So there's like people coming and running for these seats. What they are not doing yet is taking those seats. And obviously those current races, my hope is that they do. But if you look at the margins for a lot of the races in the last cycle, a lot of them were pretty large gaps, like 10-point gaps, 15-point gaps for a lot of the progressive leftist BIPOC folk coming in. And I think that that's one, funding, two, name recognition, and three, the pandemic really curtailed the kinds of in-person grassroots organizing that I think really can shift people towards the candidate with more energy and passion. And taking that advantage away and switching entirely to digital, especially when you're trying to expand the electorate, really hamstrings your ability to actually build in that way.
But I suppose if they keep running, like, the name recognition could keep building, as well as just like seeing a more diverse amount of people like running would probably promote more people to feel like they could run as well.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it might just be like a, you know, a little bit of a slower, gradual just increase in those people running, and then hopefully you'll get a couple candidates that can, I guess you have to like go viral or something, right, to really
It seems that
get
way.
your brand out there. Because like I think of like AOC here in New York, like I didn't even live here, and yet I was bombarded with like marketing things just about her in existence. And maybe people are just not as drawn to the smaller delegation or those types of positions. But I don't know, like how do you think that you can get the word out about something that's most people just wouldn't think twice about? Like, people only care about their senator, like their federal senator,
or the general election
or something, right?
Yeah.
And just show up to the polls not knowing any of the names on the ballot, and they just check the D. And if there's multiple Ds, they just pick one, like flip a coin or something.
Yeah,
So,
no, absolutely. Well, I think we're going to test that first theory about repeat running and name recognition, because there's a really great candidate, Fatima Iqbal Zubair, who's running in SoCal for an assembly person race. And she's fantastic. And I think that, you know, her first race, she had a good showing, but didn't end up winning, and she's going to be doing it. She's running for it again. And a lot of the progressive folks out here are really behind her candidacy. And so my hope is that Fatima gets through and kind of demonstrates that theory that if you have that extra cycle to build, you'll be able to win. So we'll see on that. I'll report back to you. But in terms of, I think absolutely there's this challenge where I think the Democratic Party's been really effective, not just in California, but I imagine New York and other states as well that are quote unquote blue, is really branding themselves as the clear alternative to, you know, Republicanism. And we see that very clear divide, right? But I think that the challenge out here in California is that even if you're organizing from within the Democratic Party, I think a lot of times what you're battling again now is not Democrat or Republican, but in a lot of spaces it's Democrat versus apathy, right? It's Democrat versus disillusionment. And that's something that I think is where the grassroots organizing comes in, where it's getting people to be reinvigorated by the ideas and the candidates who are vessels for those ideas. And so I think it has to be, you know, district by district, city by city, and it can't be statewide. Because we've seen both nationally and statewide that one size fits all messaging, it doesn't turn out undecided voters to the degree that we want. Like 2020 was as obvious a choice as possible nationally, and yet Democrats lost ground in the House. The place where they lost ground in particular were in California. Asian American women, Republicans beating Democratic incumbents. That's the largest set of losses among the Democratic Party nationally, was in California in those groups. And what does that say to me as someone who saw those races as winnable? Is that when the Republican Party is sending out someone who is closer to the community, when they're sending out someone who is communicating in a way that is not the kind of bogeyman that we have image of the Democratic Party nationally, that one size fits all messaging falls apart for Democrats, and then they don't win. And so I think that having those not uncompromisingly, but I think unapologetically people-powered movements, like that's the answer, to reorient people towards that work, instead of just parroting the kind of safe party line that ends up actually being incredibly dangerous for electoral majorities.
It's like wild to me because it just brings up moments when during the last election I'd hear people say like, oh, I don't vote, my vote doesn't count. But it's just like a snake eating its own tail or something, like, oh, nothing's going to change, I don't vote. Nothing's going to change, I don't vote. Like, it's so, I know when I worked in canvassing, that's what I found like the hardest to like not get discouraged by, is that it's hard to reshape someone's lack of just apathy or I don't even know, like their trauma response to how society views them. It's hard to reshape that.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't take the threat of a fascist takeover to light a fire under people's ass.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I wish we could get people passionate without it coming to that, right? Because I think people have been reinvigorated lately, or at least in 2020 maybe.
The never Trump movement.
But
right?
now I'm sure a large majority of those people have settled right back into their apathy, and it's business as usual, and people just don't want to care about politics. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of educating yourself.
And a lot of upkeep, a lot of maintenance.
Right.
And I would also put a lot of that pressure on, I think, both state parties and then also community organizing groups and candidates within the districts, because it's also, I think, to the discredit of a lot of organizations and leaders that they don't make it a consistent presence. I think one thing that I was impressed by with the Bernie campaign in 2020 was that his campaign had realized that they did a really bad job with like Latinx outreach. And so they built a lot of efforts in states like Nevada and California, where they were starting from a very like well before the primary cycle, just building relationships. And Bernie Sanders won Los Angeles County handily because he'd built those relationships with a lot of community groups, such as Latinx groups out here. So I think that part of it is also taking for granted that will turn out. We as in, rank and file voters, we as in community members. And I think that having that sustained, like genuine community presence, like actually knowing what are the events happening in the communities you're in, like what are the big losses that are happening. I live in Long Beach, California, and there's this Cambodian market, Cage Market, that's been around for almost 2 decades. That's just closed like 2 days ago because of gentrification, because their like complex got purchased and then rents got driven up. It's very clear to me which politicians in Long Beach do not know that that's a community institution, do not realize that it closed, and don't understand the impact on the community to lose a hub for folks who live in that area. And I think that absence, when it isn't the time for the ask, means that when it is time for the ask, when it is time for the vote, people see you as disconnected, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I haven't even thought about the fact that like the structure of working a campaign is so contractual. Like you don't work an off season when you're on a campaign, when in a way community organizing it's all the time. It's not just like 10 months prior to the election or 1 year prior. So I feel like that disconnect is because people view the off season as a time when like, well, I can just focus on writing the bills as opposed to keeping people included. It's I don't know, it's strange that you overwork community organizers in that short period of time, but not in a more like salary based way. I hate to put in capitalistic terms, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say that I think one of the biggest, I think reorientations we need is to think of campaigns as not an election cycle process, but think of campaigns as a relationship process. So if you think about like community organizing theory, so much of it is relational. It's about actions, not activities. Actions build toward change, actions build towards movement. And I think what happens is for a lot of candidates, their electoral victory is the end goal. And so it becomes this kind of process of, okay, we need to win this race, we need to win this race, we need to win this race. And I think that a community organizing mindset, and I think we have a lot of activists and not enough community organizers in the political sphere. I think that the community organizing mindset would be, you know, we're building this coalition to win this race. This race is a way to then advance this movement within our community and beyond. And then achieving that movement gets us this next one, and it keeps building. And so if there isn't that, 3-step, 4-step, 5-step down the horizon set of structural changes, right, then it's just going to be, let's win another race. And then it becomes that cynical thing of, let's win this race, let's decide which money to take in, let's not put in the effort we need, because if the end goal is to win the election, then you don't need to do that deep community organizing work.
Yeah, it just becomes like cult of personality at that point. You win for the candidate, not the candidate winning for the movement. It's good. Important distinction.
Can I switch gears a little bit?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, you were talking about your day job as you do like diversity type training for like corporations. Is that
a mix of clients? So I work, I guess before this job, I worked in a nonprofit in DC doing a lot of government reform. And when I was at that old job, I helped build our DEI portfolio, so diversity, equity, inclusion. And you'll probably hear this alphabet soup. You'll hear JEDI, you'll hear DEI, DANDI, DBIB, DEIB. So take your pick of which word salad. But I mean, I think that basically what I do is, I think of it as understanding an organization and then understanding how that organization impacts the people within it, and then shifting the systems and structures in place there. So we have a lot of companies that we work with, and I'll work with nonprofits, I'll work with foundations, I'll work with for-profit companies. I think that what ends up happening is there's this sort of galvanization to do something, like italicize, underline, quote unquote, whatever, like do something, but they lack direction. And so I think what I do basically is, one, educate the market. Here are the things that you need to sell to that market. Like, here's the type of interventions I recommend. And then 3, like actually design things for these organizations that will help them change in the way that they need to change, which is not just training, but also a lot of structural interventions as well.
Oh, okay. I guess my question about it was like, how much has that practice or methodology changed in the last couple of years as like the conversations about inclusivity or racism have sort of been galvanized a little bit? And then I know like last year they had the Stop AAP I Hate movement. Like, are people more receptive to the changes? Are people like reaching out a lot more because they know that they need to do something? They put on their memo, like, we're going to do something. Because I know a lot of organizations have done that, like, we're going to restructure everything, or we're going to change the way that we do this, but I don't actually know a lot of the ways that they have.
Yeah, I can give you the 75-second quick and dirty history of the diversity and inclusion industry.
Okay.
Hold me to that.
Timer on.
Yeah. Well, I think I would say that a lot of the DEI work, I'm going to use DEI just for convenience sake, but pick your alphabet soup like combination here. I think that for the DEI work that I've been doing, I draw from a lot of the roots in both community organizing and critical race theory. So a lot of those spaces that were both on the ground and also in academia that were really thinking in their own ways about systems and structures. As D&I efforts started to increase in organizations, it became a very HR project, right? A lot of the early D&I work was usually diversity and harassment were typically bundled. So it was like, do we have a representative demographic in our company? And do we have anti-harassment policies in place? So that's what kind of like the early phase ended up being for a lot of what got rolled out to companies worldwide and across the US at a large scale. We're reaching this point now where there's a lot more centering equity within that space. So it's not just diversity, which is like who's in the organization, not just inclusion, how people like feel within the company, but then also are there structures that are are fair, and is there an understanding of historical inequities as part of that conversation. And then some groups will center justice, belonging, other components in there, accessibility. But I think that's really the challenge here, is that there are different things, different ways that it looks, and not everyone knows what they want or what they need, because there's been so many different modalities of DEI work.
Do you still ever get any like pushback? Because I hear a lot of people complain about their critical race theory trainings at work, or I've read a lot of anecdotal pieces about like, oh, they taught my kids this in school, and I'm curious about it. Like, do you still feel like there are a lot of people that you work with that really resist listening to any of it?
Yeah, well, my last job working with government, we had an whole executive order from the Trump administration saying you couldn't do these things. So we had some pretty big pushback.
Okay,
That's pretty big pushback.
Did you all see that one? It was
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
summer. Yeah. So yes.
Because he called it racist.
And
I remember
un-American.
And un-American,
Oh, my.
exactly, yeah.
Just to really cherry on top that. It's okay. As you know, with this face, I've definitely gotten un-American before. So, you know, part of the job. But I think to your question, I think that what I'll say is here's how to kind of enter into a company. Usually what they're doing is they're realizing, oh shoot, this quote unquote priority that's been on our website for years has not actually seen funding, staff time, or explicit programs connected to it. And so they sort of, you know, they kind of hand wave it, and they're like, okay, like we'll get to it. And then when a crisis happens and the employees say, why is our statement messed up and slow and unresponsive to our needs? And why don't we have these structures in place internally to support us? Companies are like, oh, shoot, we need to do something. And so then they start looking out in the market for D&I, DEI firms to try and figure out, you know, who can help them. Usually the first thing they ask for are trainings, because that's what they have sort of seen in the market as a value add. Now, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research that shows that if you do a training alone, that's not going to make sustainable structural change for a company, but they don't really know that. And then you'll also see companies that'll hire a chief diversity officer, give them no support staff, no funding, and then burn them out within 2 years, right? That's another common trope. So what I do at my company is we basically look at organizations and do a full assessment, not just of how people are feeling qualitatively, but also what are the actual policies and structures in place? How are you doing promotions and hiring? What are your turnover rates? How are you advancing individuals? How are you creating support structures? Are there inequities within how your organization runs? Because if you're not also changing the policies and practices, and you're only doing trainings, you're pushing a lot of the pressure to make change to rank and file individuals in the company, and kind of abdicating some of the responsibility as leadership to actually change how you do your work. And so that's really what I try and impress upon companies, is you don't want to just hire us for trainings. Anyone can do a training. It can help in the moment. But if you don't pair that training with structural changes, just like in politics, right? If you don't pair these band-aid moves with structural changes, it's not going to actually make a difference for the employee 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and it's just not going to last.
It's the same energy as like the oil companies telling you to recycle, but not doing anything themselves.
Well, isn't a lot of it just that it's cheaper? Like, it's probably cheaper to pay you to do one training than it is to bring someone on for a few years and have them, restructure everything.
I mean, cheaper in terms of money and also just mental labor.
Right.
Like, folks don't want to actually rethink, like, oh, how can we restructure our organization in a way that's equitable?
Right. Because a lot of them probably just don't want any more crises to happen. Right. Whatever the bare minimum they can do to not have people, causing a big PR fuss. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two things that I think are common conversations. I think one is getting people to understand, why DEI should be a priority for an organization and not an afterthought. Some people really lead with the business case, and there's a lot of research on why for an organization, if you have more diversity, more equity, more inclusion, more belonging, you're going to be a higher performing organization. Like there's lots on that. But there's also a lot of research around how kind of there's this moral versus instrumental case for these kinds of efforts. If there's a moral case for it, right, that's usually what galvanizes particularly BIPOC folk and historically oppressed groups. Like the moral case would basically be something like, as an organization, we have a responsibility to ensure that all of our employees are supported. We need to take into account the history that we're grappling with right now and act upon that. Like that's kind of like the moral case. For a lot of folks, there's research around how, in particular, white individuals are more likely to respond to the instrumental case, which is basically, here's how your business will perform better. Here's how you'll have higher profit margins. Here's how teams are more innovative, right? And so there's actually, that research found that there's also a sort of loss for each of those groups when you make the wrong case. So if you make an instrumental case to like me as an Asian American, for example, I'm going to be like, I don't need you to tell me about how I'm going to help you improve your capitalistic endeavor. I want to know that you give a shit about me as a human being. Right. And for someone who's maybe a like white nonprofit CEO, and you come in and say, hey, we have a moral responsibility as a nonprofit organization to be like expanding our moral circle and like doing all these work. They might say, hey, like I'm running a business here. That seems very irresponsible and not thought through. And so that's one of the things that what we grapple with a lot is, like how do you make the case for this being a true imperative and not just that afterthought? The other thing that I'll quickly add is, to your point about cost, absolutely. It's lower cost to hire trainings, and a lot of DEI orgs would only do trainings because that's higher margin for us, because a training is pretty easy to roll out there and you do it. You do your 2 hours, you get paid really well. Assessments are less high margin. And so there's also that perverse incentive for DEI companies to not do the best intervention because it's higher margin for your employees to just do a bunch of 2-hour trainings and rake in cash. And I don't think that's the responsible thing to do, but it's understandable because of the market that we're in.
Right. They don't include morality in their budget, right?
No.
Like, there's no room for that in the business model.
There's also
classic
no,
capitalism.
Like, internalized, I don't know, I'm making up shit, but like internalized HR research team that's like why does the DEI org like have to be in charge of assessments? Why isn't HR also keeping track of this stuff? I mean, calling it what it is, it's just lazy. It's just straight up lazy.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like how there's just all these like bringing a third party. You shouldn't necessarily have to do that. You should be able to handle it inside.
Right.
If you think about the incentives for HR though, and this is why also I think unions are important and like labor organizing is important, because I think that there are certain functions that within a capitalist, particularly corporate system, there simply aren't these structural incentives for something like an HR team to actually do the deep structural work needed. And so I think that like DEI work and labor organizing go kind of hand in hand within a company or with an organization or institution to identify and shift structures and use their relative power in different ways that you're not going to see even from a very well-meaning HR team, but they also should be doing those things, right? So like I also don't want to write them off and say, hey, like contract it all out. Like you should be putting in this work. And also whenever you're an impediment, you got to bring someone in to remove the barriers that you have for yourself.
Do you know if actual political like staffers or like campaign groups have also like reached out to DEI groups? Because we had a campaign in New York for mayor. I won't put her on blast, but one of the more progressive candidates who just had a lot of people quit and they tried to unionize and then they got fired. And it's like, wait, but you were the one, like you were the most progressive candidate and you couldn't manage this situation. And people were claiming racial discrimination and sexual harassment and all this stuff. So do you think like Is that happening, or do a lot of these more progressive campaign organizations just think like we're fine because we're progressives?
Yes and yes. So, okay, that's a really, really good question because I think that this is something that a lot of groups are, I don't think this is something that everyone has grappled with and talked through, both California Dems nationally, and I think it's really important. Um, there is absolutely a conflation, and you see this in a lot of campaigns and candidacies, a conflation between the politics you espouse and the practices that you instill. And I think that that's one of the challenges. Um, is the environment of a campaign, for example, is so fast paced, is so high tempo, is so high stakes that um, when they don't have these structures baked in and these really effective practitioners doing the good work, what's going to end up happening is they're going to revert back to a lot of the instincts, the rhythms, the muscle memory, which may be re-entrenching some of these problematic practices. Like there is some really interesting work. Tema Oakland has a great reading on how white supremacy culture shows up in nonprofits and how some of that, I highly recommend checking that out at some point, but there's a lot of interesting work around how white supremacy culture can filter into organizations. And I think campaigns are exactly that. You can have a BIPOC-led progressive candidacy that will also be a terrible place to work that is failing internally. And so I think that there needs to be that intention from the beginning that how you treat your employees internally is a referendum on how you will manage and lead in office. And I think that becomes kind of a second thought because you're scrambling and you have short on resources and you need to win this thing, and you quickly fall into the same sort of cost benefit analysis that companies go through where they say, hey, I need to invest in these top salespeople and I'm not going to spend 2 hours a week for them in trainings. And the reality is that if you're papering it over at the end, you've got these structural changes that, like 2 months out of the election date are going to rear their heads. And so I think that it's a call to action, but also a reminder that like what we say is not what we do.
Right. Another indication of just how messy electoral politics is. It's like we have to do the wrong thing so that we can win and do the right thing later.
Right. And then when does the right thing start? And
Yeah,
when
because
is the
then you
wrong
got to
thing?
get reelected and you got to
Yeah.
actually do the work. And so I agree with you that you should probably just do that structural change from the get with that intention before.
And I think there were a couple campaigns that had unions to begin with, or like were open to it this last cycle, at least at the presidential level. So I think that's helpful. But to your point, I mean, look at the Biden administration, right? Like I think that they're doing a lot of good work in some spaces and some annoyingly unchanged work in other spaces. But if you look demographically, right, like I would wager to bet that like internally, there's still a little bit of a tokenistic approach to diversity, at least in the White House level. And I think there are people who are like pushing that mindset, but I think writ large, it is still a bit tokenistic. And that's something that manifests in who has positional power, right, in that organization, in that institution for years, right, and who runs multi-billion dollar budgets.
Yeah, it seemed like the Biden administration was trying to hit all the first, like as
Right.
quickly as they can. So
Like
then,
bingo.
How historic can we make this administration?
Yeah.
Because even they had Jean Pierre speak at the press briefings. Like this is the second Black woman ever to lead the press conference, and it's like how are we still having these like accolades come up? Even, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like for me, I'm for the symbolic moments like that, but I'm also like, I guess he's saying like the negative connotation of tokenism is it only for that sake, not for continuing the movement or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I would say, I think if they are bringing someone in and the entire bio is this is how they are historic, right? I think that's a really good indicator of a gap there. And I think what's been interesting is, when we bring in people into these like cabinet level positions, for example, so much of it, and they probably have some whiteboard, right? Like in the presidential personnel office, right? Where they're like, all right, let's mix and match. And some of it is it's also political, right? It's like which coalitions do you stay in the good graces of? But I know that it's also, I also want to just quickly flag that we may also just generationally be demanding more. I know a lot of people who are so happy, right, to say, hey, look at this,
Yeah.
I know I don't agree with this person and everything, but look at this, that person's there. I that's so powerful. And while I demand more, I also realize that there are a lot of folks I know who, for whom that is a watershed moment, and I don't want to invalidate that feeling, even as I say, hey, it's great that you have your first I don't know, Black Secretary of Defense, but also we don't need more money into our defense budget to
Right.
yeah, so it's kind of that multi-level thing there.
Yeah, I mean, it takes me back to 2008 even, because that felt like such a watershed moment, and it obviously was, and no one can take away the weight of that moment. But you do realize over time that oh, that's not we didn't get everything out of this. We got this nice symbolic moment, and
then
you
still
have
got
to
the US
still
president.
have to pick apart every single thing they do and see whether they're actually fighting for your interests.
Yeah.
And so when I see the first Black press briefing speaker, I still want to hear how they do, and I want to know that they're doing a good job, right? So
yeah.
But I mean, of course, embedded in that, someone like Jean Pierre or Kamala Harris, whatever it may be, commonly have to do twice, 3 times the amount of work to get to that position. So I feel like it's always embedded in the fact that person is qualified of being there. I think it's unfortunate because they're not the only qualified person to be there. Right. I think that's where the true conversation's coming up.
Yeah.
I mean, look Pete Buttigieg having the transportation job that he does. Very accomplished political figure, but he has no offense to Mayor Pete, but he does not have any credentials,
He listens to this podcast, so watch what you say.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Chasen.
Does kind of
question how, and generally with the cast people we bring on, it's assumed of we share politics or may probably exist in the same part of the party. But one question I've never asked is how did you arrive at being a progressive? What made you choose this particular part of the party?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because I think we often, just to step back and be meta for a second, I think that people who assume shared politics assume shared stories, and that's really rarely the case. And I think that as organizers, that helps us to understand how people come to this space. For me, my family's from the Philippines. I'm the first generation born in the US, and I grew up in Long Beach, California, which is a part of LA County, with a really large, for example, Cambodian population, because a lot of refugees from the Khmer Rouge, a lot of Filipinos, particularly nurses, because there was an incentive to bring nurses in, big Black population, big Latinx population. There are a lot of historical forces at play that I didn't know or could articulate at the time. But I knew that people always were like, Long Beach has great diversity. This is something we're going to celebrate. But people celebrated the diversity for as long as it was convenient. I remember during the recession, I had there would be classes where, and this seems weird thinking back, but I remember one class in this public, I went to a public school with 5,000 students. There was one class where it was so over impacted with students that if you showed up late, there wasn't a seat for you. You had to sit on someone else's desk or the floor or something like that. And not to say that it was a terrible experience or that it was all so hard or anything like that. I don't want to overinflate my experience or struggle, but going from that to an elite university and getting lucky to get a scholarship and all of this, and seeing how much was there at this school that I was entering into, that was staggering to me. Stanford had a $24.5 billion endowment. We had 3 custodial staff per dormitory, basically, whereas my old high school had 3 for the entire 5,000 person campus. Stanford's not that much bigger than my old high school population-wise for undergrads versus the high school students I was with. And so I think for me, it was the politicization came from seeing the disconnect between the diversity we celebrated and the lived experiences of the people around me. and then seeing the blatant inequity and inequality coming into these institutional spaces that I had access to, but a friend who looked just like me didn't. And I think those were the seeds. And then I think theory helped, community organizing spaces helped. I think that I want to yell at the freshman version of myself because there are some things that I like came in and believed, right? I was afraid of weed like for a couple years in high school, right? Like that's not the case anymore. Yeah.
I definitely,
yeah.
sorry to put a pause on that. I definitely cringe at my early like establishment self.
Yeah.
Who doesn't?
It was very Nancy
Establishment
Pelosi in
drone.
2009.
We've already rehashed my shameful past as well.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so.
But sorry to interrupt you. Go on.
No. I was just going to add that I think the reason why I think I am always thinking about those seeds being planted is that when I look at a lot of my family who came here to the US, like a lot of them are here having placed a lot of faith in the systems and structures and institutions of the US. I have like a lot of my family is in various parts of the US military, the Navy, and a lot of family members who came in and like worked at like the post office or worked as nurses or all these things. And I think that there is so much trust that has to be placed in the US as an idea and the institutions of the US as a structure as part of that process of moving from the Philippines to the United States. And I feel like I'm a part of the generation, at least in my family, who has the opportunity and also the privilege to structurally critique and the tools to do so. And I think that a lot of my aunts and uncles didn't, maybe are learning to, maybe will never, but I could identify to some extent like white supremacy structures when I see it. And saying white supremacy is a new thing for a lot of my family over the last year, right? And so part of it is on me to be able to communicate that and scaffold it in a way that can be heard where they are and relevant and not just like ivory tower theory.
It speaks to me because I know back when I started school, I took this class that we talked a lot about materialism, and I remember going on like a tirade about like materialisticness in society and blah blah blah. But the funny thing is, I was just anti-capitalist, but I didn't have the language to say so. I feel like we have the experiences to know what's going on, but like you said, it's wrapped up in ivy towered or like collegiate paywalls, to be frank, and that's really unfortunate.
I will say, if you've ever seen it, there's a resource called Scihub, which is basically academic journal pirating.
So I love that.
Because like the actual, like if you buy an academic journal, my understanding is that the money doesn't actually go to the people who did the research or write it. So for example, it's not like if I like, I don't know, stream a song on Spotify and like X artist gets like 1.5 cents. Like it's more like if you buy like a $10 journal article from like the American Academy of whatever, that's not, no percentage of that from that sale is going to go to the academic. They get paid through the institution. There's public funding in that. Like they get their tenure job if they're a tenure professor. Like they'll get their salary through all of that. They're not going to get a commission off of sales of journal articles. So with that, not to tell you to steal, but if that liberates a little bit of your proclivities there, I mean, I won't judge you. It's an unpaid plug
our first sponsor.
Yeah, our first sponsor.
They're not paying us, but go steal academic journals.
I know that's a hot topic right off the, everyone wants
I love it.
Jack, American Journal of Psychology or whatever.
Well, I think we should wrap up, right? It's round 3. Is there any like final thought or something you want to plug or something you want to draw attention to, Joshua, before we wrap?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, thank you for creating this space, for bringing me on. Really enjoy the conversation, and I think that we have a lot of the challenges that I'm talking about in California and in like the DEI industry. Like these rhyme with so many of the problems that you're talking about in New York, that we're talking about nationally. There's a couple things that I would point folks to. Number one, there's been a lot of challenges, specifically within the Filipinx community in the US. Only about 4% of, as an example, only about 4% of the nurses in the US are Filipino, but around 30% of the COVID-19 deaths in nursing are Filipino, right? So we're nearly a third of the deaths because we're frontline workers, even though we're a relatively small share. So I recommend that folks take a look at the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns, or NAFCON, and they have some fundraising going on, including an initiative called Bayanihan Community Response, which is basically a mutual aid program to provide funding, prepaid debit cards, food for community members, eviction rights supports, things like that. So everything from education to resources. So I highly recommend folks take a look at those. And I'll also just say, if you are in a place of positional power within a company or an organization, and you have the ability to push for, structural changes like DEI work, what I strongly recommend is to look at it, to make the case for the full scale, like assessments and roadmaps and trainings. I work at a firm called Peopleism, and so feel free to reach out to us as well if there's anything that would be helpful in that space. But I think that's everything from me. Call me, bleep me, y'all know how to reach me.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you for listening to the Avant Inn. I'm one of your hosts, Topher Wagner.
And I'm another host, Jerome Allen.
Thank you so much to our guest, Joshua De Leon. That was a really great conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. You are brilliant, and thank you so much for coming on. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on your notifications, all that. If you liked our theme song, credit goes to Knox Engler for the song Men. And my closing quote will be, stop using Band-Aids. Because they're racist and they don't do enough, okay?
Unless you're bleeding, in which case use a Band-Aid.
Okay, you can use a Band-Aid, but sometimes it's not enough.
Or just okay, no, this is rabbit hole. Goodbye.